Here's the demo, and you can follow along if you want or just watch it. The homework assignment sheet actually goes into pretty good descriptive requests of how to do this. It's not a step-by-step, but it talks about the stages you'll need to make. So this is pretty primitive. It's a little bit on the low res side, so we'll see some sketchiness there, but basically all it is a two-dimensional image that was cut out from its background and an old photograph of the stage. And these are the two shadows that were made. And you can see that these are the masks associated with them. And the idea is to be able to cast the shadow and then blur it and make it transparent enough so that you can see color through it. And I'll go through that workflow. So yeah, don't look for perfect realism here. This is an illustration, and it's just a mock-up. So starting with, I'm going to go back to the other kind of panel display here. So it looks normal. It looks like what you see on yours. So the first thing is to remove the original background of the photograph, and this has already been done, so I'm just going to leave that part out of the demo. And the easiest way to cast a shadow like this, as you probably know, is to use Photoshop's internal drop shadow tool. But there's another way of doing it. Rather than create the drop shadow and then tear it off, before we had the ability to do that in Photoshop, the way I would do it is just simply copy the layer and fill it with black. That's one way, so I'll just show you what that would look like. So here's the guitarist copy, and then the layer that looks identical to it. Doesn't matter what they say on them. And then if I want to load this with black, I can either turn on transparency, but in this case what I'll do is just Command-click and go to fill with black. I'll just show you both methods here. Okay, foreground color is black, so that's okay. And so really that's what you end up with. I'll drop the selections with Command-D. And now what I need to do is soften that shadow and lean it down to make the one that's on the floor. So again, this is one way of doing it. That's one way of creating a duplicate and calling that one a shadow. So I'm just going to call that a shadow here. So the way I do it is I go to Transform and Distort. So I can do that with Command-T, brings me the transform box, and then if I hold down either right-click or hold down Control, I can go down to Distort. And Distort lets me lay this down and based on where this little center point is, I can really move this around in order to make sure that it's creating the right connective shadow to the toes and the heel of the shoe. So I'm just going to say that that's about where I want it and say OK. And then what I can do at this point is I can create a smart filter. Again, that's an option, but this is the one that gives me editability. And I'll go into Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and give it the kind of blur that I decide at the time is helpful. Now, if this was a spotlight, that would be a pretty hard shadow, but it does blur as it falls further away, so I'm going to create that blur keeping this part in mind, and then I can fix this part with a mask. So I'm really creating the blur based on this part. It also helps to turn this to multiply and lower the opacity so that you can see through it, and that also helps you decide how soft to make your blur. So you can do it in either, whatever is easiest for you. And then what do I have to do next? What's that? Anyone have any idea what I would choose to do? I got to mask off the part that's on the curtain because the curtain's on a different plane. And I've got to make this shadow get harder towards the feet. And the way to do that is, since I made a smart filter, it has a mask. I know you guys have already done some of this, making sure that this is black. What I do is just lower the opacity of the brush. And what I'm doing is I'm brushing away the Gaussian blur effect. I'm doing it ham-fisted here so you can see it better on the screen. I would do it more subtly normally, so actually I'll hit the number 1 for 10%. And all I'm doing is I'm masking away the Gaussian blur effect, or I want the shadow to be hardest so that as it falls off it gets softer. And then the heavy lifting is going to be done with a mask directly on the layer, and that's where I have to opaque out the shadow or mask out the shadow. So I need to set my brush to full opacity and basically paint it out. And luckily there's a shadow under the curtain, so I don't have to be super accurate there as long as my brush covers all of the actual hanging draped curtain. I've done that part of it.
Are you the type of illustrator to let things kind of slide a little bit if you can hide it within your picture? Or do you like to make it super precise?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean.
Like you just said, you can hide it under the shadow.
You mean because my mask isn't super accurate?
Well, no, I'm not saying like that. I really not say, right? Some people will definitely try to hide things within their photos and not fix it all the way if they can get away with it.
If you can get away with it,
right.
Take the shortest route, spend the least amount of time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all about reproducibility, what'll show up. As long as my monitor is calibrated and I can zoom in and see if there's any mistakes, I'm good to go. There's a little bit there. So yeah, zoom in. Oh, before I hand in anything, I go and I zoom everything into 100% and go through the whole piece, make sure there isn't any stray marks. Eventually, usually I'll find something that I missed while working fast. And then the same thing would be necessary for the curtain shadow. I'm just going to copy this again. I'm going to use the layer beneath because the shadow has to be underneath your actual object, obviously, or else it'll be in front. I'm going to again command click it. I could have also just copied the first one that I made before doing all this work and I would have had 2 layers. But I'm just showing you the workflow step by step. Again, fill with black, and then I've got to move this one so that it appears on the curtain. So this one has to move manually, so there I am on the shadow layer, and I actually remember that I have this automatically select, so if I click here to try to move that shadow, it's going to jump up to this layer. So I'm going to go Command Z to bring that back. I can drop the marching ants, and if I want to move that shadow, I have to turn this auto select off. Now I can move it. So what I want to do is move it to its new position, and if I need to transform it, then I will. I'm also going to make a smart filtered layer out of that. So now it's a smart filtered object, and I'll do the Gaussian blur again. This time it should be a little bit more blurred than its last blur, like it always remembers where you were because it's furthest away. And I can change that at any time, so I'm not going to be too worried about getting it exactly right now, but I try. I might decide later it's a little bit too much. And of course I want to turn that to multiply and lower the opacity so that the shadow is transparent and shows the curtain, because there's no such thing as a fully opaque shadow. There's no such thing. There's always going to be enough ambient light for you to see, and so if there's enough ambient light for you to see, there's some light pouring into a shadow, even if it's right next to the object. That makes sense? Ambient light fills shadows. So you always need to lower the opacity of any shadow layer if it's fully black. If I want to take into account the direction that the light's coming from, you can see by the shadow on the guitar that the light is where? It's slightly above, or mostly above, which makes sense because stage lights are usually not coming from the floor. And if they are, then they make ghoulish shadows that are large and looming. So in this case, I need to lower this shadow to simulate the direction of the light. This is what's going to tell you where the light is. Now I know that there's probably more than one light here. You can see that the shadow from the arm is indicating that there's a light from up here. That's going to be considered a secondary light too. All I want to do is position the shadow so it looks realistically as to where the light's coming from. And then of course I need to mask it and get rid of the part that doesn't need to be here anymore. I'm going to use a bigger brush and just go in there and mask it. So yeah, it's a lot of work, but when you do composites, and you will, or you will be asked to, it's a really good feather in your cap to be able to have more than one kind of photography. You may say, I'm just going to be a portrait artist. That's fine. If you can make a living as a portrait photographer, and many people can, fantastic. Eventually, someone's going to say, you know, so-and-so can't show up. Can you add them in later? And I can't tell you how many times that happens. So that's the basic move here. What else could I do to make this shadow more accurate to reality? Can you yell it out so I can hear it?
Add an anchor shadow?
Under his feet? Yeah, absolutely. Anchor or base shadow. There's one more thing about the shadow that's being cast on the curtains. Is the curtain flat?
No.
So what happens to the shadow as it hits these nooks and crannies and dips and folds? It has to follow around them. Now that's a lot of work, but you can simulate the idea of it in Liquify. Either in Liquify, or you can literally go in and tweak a mask here. I think Liquify is a great tool, so I like using it. But you know, if I needed to, I could take a soft brush, not this one. And no matter how soft that brush is, it's still going to be a little bit hard to control. Now I'm just using a trackpad right now, but if I was using a Wacom tablet, I'll grab mine and see if it enhances this. I should be able to stroke very, very gently, as long as this is set to a low opacity, and take off much smaller bites as I mask into the shadow and simulate the shadow hitting different levels of the fold of the curtain. I'm just kind of rushing through it now to show you the idea of what I'm talking about. The other way of doing it, I'm just going to use Command-Z to back up, is I could go to, make sure I'm back on the layer, I could go to Liquify, and I would enlarge this, Command plus, holding down the space bar to bring it down here. The trick here is it's a little bit harder to sometimes see what it is that you're masking against. So it's a little bit more touch and go. But you can also manipulate the shadow this way. And I'd want to use much lower pressure. But here I can stretch and make that shadow do what I want it to do. So that's kind of obsessive stuff, but that's the difference between faking reality and not reality. You may never have to do it, but you may. So I'm going to end the workflow with that. I showed you one way of doing it by kind of cloning the layer and then turning it black. And then the other way is to do what I did here, which is instead I'm using Photoshop's drop shadow. This is more like what I showed last week. And then doing the blur in here. And this is nice too because it's just as editable. So several ways of doing it. And then if I was to do it this way, I have to tear off that as a separate layer. The way I need to do that is, you remember, I go to Layer, and where is it? Layer Style. No, it's something like Make Layer. I'm missing it right now. Oh, sorry, I was looking right at it. Create Layer. And that tears off the drop shadow from being part of that and gives me a separate shadow to manipulate. And again, I can just make a mask, bring my brush up, full opacity, and work non-destructively that way. So 2 ways of getting to the same end. And I'm just going to end it now.